All right, I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Elizabeth Harris has written a very funny, smart, cool, groovy novel set in the suburbs of New Jersey. All props to New Jersey. And I was so lost in this book, and I love these people. And you know Elizabeth has been a journalist with the New York Times for quite some time. And I'm pretty sure, not having known her as a tiny person, that she has been taking notes on all of us since the minute she could hold a pencil. And if you are part of her family, I'm sorry she has been taking notes on you since the minute she noticed there were other people in the room. And I will say, How to Sleep at Night is a lot of fun. If you haven't read it yet, please, what are you doing? It's a weekend read. It's delightful. It is absolutely delightful. You know, who doesn't like to hang out in someone else's life? So hi, Liz.
Hi.
How are you?
I am great. Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to see you. I do want to talk about this book, though, because there's some structural stuff that you do. There's a cast that is super tight and very small and very delightful. But let's talk about the origin of the novel first, because also you had a day job. You're writing hundreds of thousands of words a year, grinding out copy in the nicest possible way. There are reporters in the room.
You got an editor back there.
Yeah, exactly. I recognize you people. But honestly, writing a novel is not the same as delivering daily copy. You got to think about these people in a different way. You have to think about what you're doing in a different way. So I really want to talk about how the book started for you.
Absolutely. So there are kind of several answers to that question. The first is sort of the idea, right? Like, where's the idea come from? So the book is about, it's about marriage and ambition and basically what happens when who you are in the world doesn't match how you see yourself.
Right.
And there's a woman who's become a stay-at-home mom, like entirely by accident and feels like an accessory in her husband's life. And it's a terrible fit for her. There's a woman whose career is her entire life, but it's a job she's come to dread and resent. And then there are two men who are married. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican. And as the book begins, the Republican decides to run for office. So the first little germ for this story came from there are a few couples in my extended family who don't agree with their spouses on politics. And, you know, some of them have been together for 15 years, 20 years, 40 years. And it's always, I don't think it's ever been anyone's favorite thing.
Right.
But it was kind of annoying and just sort of a thing they dealt with. And it has gotten more complicated and more tense over the last several years. But they're all still married, and happily so. And so I sort of wondered how they did it. And one day I was sort of thinking about them and thought, God, you know, it would be terrible if one of them ran for office. Oh! It would be terrible if one of them ran for office. That would be awful. Oh, how interesting. And, you know, I started thinking about that, like, okay, it's sort of obviously not appealing, but, like, what about it would be so uncomfortable and difficult? And the sort of two answers that I came up with were, you know, that you're in this position where, like, how far can you go to support the person that you love while also not betraying your own values? And then the other is that you would sort of become famous for these values that you detest. And everyone would assume all of these things about you that aren't true. And so kind of from there, you know, I didn't want to write a book about politics. I wanted to write a book about marriage and family, and so started to think about kind of ways to broaden this out. And so kind of what are other ways you can lose the thread of your own story, basically. So this was 2021, and so my kids are back in school, and my wife, who is over there, hello, and is a doctor, so she'd never stopped going to work. But I wasn't really going to work. Like, we weren't really back in the office. There just were not a lot of meetings. There were not a lot of lunches, you know, all that stuff. So I had, you know, an hour and a half a day when I would normally be on the subway. And I thought, well, I have an idea, and I have wanted to write fiction my entire life. And so I thought, well, I have this time. I might as well just see what I can do with it. And that was how it started.
Okay. It also feels like a coming-of-age novel to me. I mean, we have this idea, right, that coming-of-age novels are supposed to feature teenagers and adolescents sort of rattling their way through. And, I mean, I would hope we continue to evolve as we go, right? Like, it shouldn't be
I guess
limited
I'm done.
just to the teenagers, right? But I really like these characters. I really like Ethan and Gabe, and I really like Nicole and her husband, Austin, and I really like Kate. And so it's this sort of core group of people that are familiar enough, right? And they all sort of meet when they're young-ish. And then we get to meet them as things are sort of progressing quickly. And I just want to talk about, there's the core four, and I'm sort of dancing around this a little bit just in case there are folks who have not yet read the book. The center couples, how did we get them? Who showed up first?
Let's see. Who showed up first? I guess, it all kind of happened. They kind of appeared kind of quickly in a way. Like I had this sort of like, okay, like, that sort of first little germ. And then very quickly I thought of like, what are other ways do you lose yourself? And these four people kind of popped up fairly quickly, but it's really in my brain anyway, it's really a book about three of them.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the three people who aren't really in control of who they are in other people's eyes. And as it's written, actually, the three of them, it shifts perspectives, but the guy who's running for office never gets a perspective.
Right.
And it's because he's making the choices, right? And everyone else is sort of like, kind of spinning out, trying to, figure out how to kind of get their hands back on the wheel. And he's not. So he gets enough. Too bad for him. So no perspective. I guess they all kind of arrived together. Maybe someone came first, but I don't even remember. It was all kind of like crash, crash, crash. Which is fun.
I mean, because when I think about my college years and sort of the immediate aftermath of college, figuring out how to be an adult and whatnot, to see these folks sort of evolve together and apart at the same time and then fall back into sort of not necessarily patterns of being, but I mean, I have friends where I may not talk to them for like a year, and then you pick up the phone and it's like, oh, right, hi. And it's just immediate sort of, exactly what's going on. And it's nice to catch up with them, and then you talk to them again in like 2 years, and it's fine. Everything in this book feels very organic.
Oh, good.
Which, for anyone who reads a lot of fiction, who writes fiction, who edits fiction, this is not something that happens easily. So let's talk about process for a second. Short chapters, tight spaces, tiny cast. You've been taking notes for a really long time.
I'm forever an English major at heart.
Okay. As a non-English major, though, what does that mean? Like, seriously, kids' books, where did you start thinking, oh, this is what I want?
Oh, gosh, really? Want to go that far back?
Yeah, we are.
Well, the first book I ever wrote was about cheese.
Okay.
I think I was in second grade, first grade, something like that. And I was very upset because everyone else liked cheese and I didn't like cheese. It was very upsetting. Anyway, but it had a great, it has surprise.
Wait, you don't like cheese?
I do now. I didn't then. I also didn't like chocolate. And the best, it's terrible. I still don't like chocolate.
Yeah, chocolate I'm not interested in. Cheese feels like a tragedy.
Can I tell you, this is a tangent, but the best response I ever got to the chocolate thing is I told someone once I didn't like chocolate, and they looked at me totally straight on and they go, oh, do you also not like laughter? I just thought that was so good. Anyway. So moving on, process. I think some of this was born out of like English major training, but a lot of it was born out of journalism.
Yep.
Because I've been a reporter at the New York Times for 15 years, and there's a real like ruthlessness about cutting and space and economy of language that is like just drilled into you every day. That I think is really helpful and was really helpful. It was definitely helpful for me in terms of putting it together. And then sort of at the end, there was actually like a huge cut at the very end. My editor and I both sort of decided that it had gotten too long, and so and she is here. Thank you, Rachel. And she is wonderful and trusts me and was like, okay, just like go for it, do what you think needs to be done, and bring it back, and we'll see if it works. And I cut like more than 15,000 words, and the novel is 80,000 words about. So it was a huge percentage, but I think that was a big journalism moment of just slash the hell out of your darlings.
And the reader here says, thank you.
You're welcome.
I mean, not that I wouldn't have taken the extra 15,000 words.
Nah, you didn't need them.
Yeah, well, I'm going to trust you on this, but the way the book ends is wildly satisfying. So I just, not to give anything away, but I have never been that invested in suburbanites. The way I was just kind of like, oh, this is, and you have this great line that got me sort of thinking about the American dream and what it represents for so many people. One of the characters, Nicole, is having a little existential moment. She's the stay-at-home mom, but she's looking around her very fancy house and saying, well, I guess it's a combination of, oh, how did you put it? I love this line. Inertia and timing is how she ends up. And the way Liz sets this up, and obviously if you spend any time with her, you know she's funny, right?
Aw,
But at the same
$10
time...
for that later. Thank you.
Huh?
I'll give you $10 for that
cool.
later. Thank you.
Rock
Yeah.
on.
Awesome.
Just not chocolate.
Fine.
I'll take
Cheese.
payment cheese.
Cheese. Payment
and
cheese.
cheese is fine.
Good.
But the way this character is sort of relating to her very fancy house on the very fancy piece of property, and just to say, yeah, it was kind of oops.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of oops that works out in this book very, very nicely. So we need to talk about the comic timing a little bit. We need to talk about setup a little bit. Because I feel like you've read a lot of plays, screenplays, that kind of thing. There's a lot that happens in the dialogue very quickly.
You know, I have not read many screenplays. I've read a lot of plays.
Okay.
I have gone, I'm a big theater person. I thought I wanted to be an actor until I realized I hated having a lot of people look at me. And then I thought, oh, wait.
Oh, so you decide to be a writer?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer, but somehow I thought the two, well, who knows? But, you know, a dialogue is also a big journalism thing, right? Like you spend so much time like looking for a money quote in a story, and you can communicate so much, and it really can like grab the reader by the collar and shake them if you've got a good quote. And so, you know, I didn't even really realize, but like when I started writing it, like the dialogue came very easily because I had spent 15 years like obsessing over when people were talking to me, being like, is that it? And having, you know, that sort of thing. And yeah, and my agent at one point actually was like, I think the first draft she read, she was like, do as much as you can in dialogue. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. That sounds fun to me. Yeah, but I'm delighted that you think it's funny.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
The thing is, I need funny, right? I mean, you've written about politics without writing about politics. You've written about class without writing about class. You've written about ambition and all of these things without quite writing about them. And so to have that breathing space, right, where I can get invested in how the characters are moving through the world, I just felt like I was immersed in the story in a way that I wasn't entirely expecting to be.
Great.
And I mean, yeah, I knew you were a journalist going into it, but not every journalist writes fiction the same way, right?
Well, can I tell you my one rule I had for myself for the whole thing was never be boring.
Yes,
that
well,
was
you succeeded.
Thank you. Because, you know, I mean, every page, every scene was very like, can't be boring, have to keep it moving. If it's not moving the story forward, you get rid of it. Like, if people are kind of talking just for the sake of talking and it's getting navel-gazy, cut it. Like, any of that had to go. And, you know, I mean, like, that is partially, again, English major, also journalism rule, right? Of like, you know, you have to earn people's attention. Right. You have the entire world in your pocket. And if you have ideas also that you want people to maybe think about, like, they have to enjoy it. Like, if they put your book down, they're not going to think about your ideas.
But also it feels like you have a sense of narrative pacing. I mean, chapters are what, between 3.5 and 5 pages? I think the longest chapter might be 5 pages.
I think in words, not in pages, but they're short.
Okay, all right. But here you are kind of flying through the story. Even when we get to the snake and the snake that goes missing.
The snake.
I was telling Liz before we started taping, I had a tiny person in my life who's now an adult who used to walk around with a rubber rat as her toy, her comfort toy. So the snake shows up and I'm laughing my head off because I was like, oh, I know a tiny girl who would like a snake. And this is where I'm going to pull in some of the audience questions because there are a pile on my lap and they're fun. And I'm also trying to stay away from spoilers because now we're getting dangerously close to, I need to ask you about a thing that I will ask you about afterwards. The couple where one of them runs for office, are they together in 5 years?
Oh, I have an answer for that.
Okay.
But, well, it is sort of a spoiler. But, I mean, should I answer it even though it's a little bit of a spoiler? What do you think?
I think
I shouldn't because I feel like it gives it away. But I would say I have a very strong feeling about that, but not everyone's going to agree with me, I would say.
I mean, I will venture that I think they are, but I think there might have been some very, very cold nights on a sofa. But I think it took them a minute to get there. But I ultimately, I think there's a lot of love. There's a lot of investment of time. There's a tiny person who's very funny, and there's still a dead snake somewhere in the house. So.
Probably on the walls. Really too bad.
Yeah, definitely in the walls.
Really too bad. Yeah.
Okay. In as much as you've always lived in the city, how did you research life in suburbia?
So I would say people have said some really lovely things about this book, but the nicest compliment I've gotten is somebody who lives in New Jersey said to me, "Where in New Jersey do you live?" And I said, "Yes, I fooled them." I do not live in New Jersey. I've never lived in New Jersey. But my wife and I live in Washington Heights, so we're right over the bridge. So we actually spend a lot of time in New Jersey, and we have a lot of friends in New Jersey, and we half of the New York Times lives in New Jersey. So, that was one of those things that like, as we've discussed, I had a very busy full-time job, and I had 2 small children when I wrote this book. So there were some choices that were made because I didn't have time to do research. So, for example, someone has to be a workaholic, so they are a journalist just because that is the world I know. And they're very different. They've had very different jobs, and I do a very different person than I am, a very different kind of journalist. But it was close enough that I knew it, right? And New Jersey was the place I knew, right? As I was it could be Long Island, it could be, no, this is the one I know. I don't have time to drive around Long Island and whatever and interview people. I know people in New Jersey.
But it also, it works because it gives you that sort of everyman sense of place. The suburbs translate really quickly in a way that cities don't necessarily.
For sure.
Even if you look at downtown New York versus uptown New York, or, the east side versus the west side, or Los Angeles, let me explain how many people do not actually understand how Los Angeles is laid out.
Me.
Oh, yeah. It's, and then there's Los Angeles County, which is not Los Angeles.
This is very confusing.
Yeah, I know, but it's a big place.
That's true.
But again, I liked sort of feeling like there was a timelessness to these marriages, the friendships, the sense of place. There are a couple of minor characters who pop up who are fundraisers, and I think we've all met people like that, respectfully. And this idea that we never really lose our sense of ambition, that we make decisions as older versions of ourselves, that younger versions of ourselves would be like, I'm sorry, what are you talking about? Or you meet people who say, well, I'm investing in the future because actually my child is involved. And if it weren't for my child, I probably would not be making this decision. And I love the way that you're playing with these big ideas in kind of a bouncy, let's look at the very expensive paint. Okay, how many people have been to a party with Liz where you're trying to guess the paint? I have done this with her.
How much does it cost? What color is it?
We were really trying to guess the name. We knew the manufacturer, but we were
expensive.
Can we Google this? Is it rude to pull out our phones and start guessing? Listen, real estate is fun. Yes. And you do bring this in, right? You've covered real estate, you've covered personal finance, you've covered a lot of all of the things that some people might consider pedestrian, and yet when you throw them in to detail as a novel, it feels like you get to eavesdrop.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so you really are taking notes, right?
Yeah, just right now. Yeah. James McBride once told me that being a reporter, he was a reporter before he was a novelist, and he was saying that it was a great training to be a novelist because you learn to walk into a room and suck up all the details. What does it smell like? Who's saying what? Is someone laughing? What does their laugh sound like? Is something dripping? Why is it dripping? What is it? What are all these things? And then what does it all mean? And you learn to pick up all these little details and explain why they matter really quickly. And I think that translated really well. But can I go back to something you said earlier that I thought was really interesting that no one has said yet, but I thought was a really interesting way to put it about this being a coming of age novel, even though everyone is they're 40 to 43, basically. And I think that's really true, right? Because that's coming of age we think of as a period of transition when you're a teenager or you're 20 or whatever. But your entire life can be that. And also when people hit their 40s, that's a big moment when people look around and they're where did I come all this way for this, right? And look around and sort of, this is my life. And sometimes that works for people and sometimes that doesn't. And that's a really interesting point to look at.
They're the people who plan their lives out, right? The people with the 5-year plans. I'm not one of those people, but and all respect to the people who can plan their lives out, but watching your cast sort of muddle their way through, everyone's really big-hearted. I just want to be clear, everyone's really generous of spirit and everyone's big-hearted, but man, they're messy. And I love them for that. I love that. I'm just no one in this book is perfect. Everyone has good intentions, but not one of them is perfect. And, we have this expectation, right, in some cases, when we're reading fiction, where it's like, not necessarily that you're looking for a happy ending, but when you come into a novel with expectations as a reader, and I do this all the time, I'm a bookseller, this is my job. But you as a reader, what are you picking up first? What are you looking for? Are you reading for voice first? Are you reading for character first? Are you reading for stuff that happens? Who are you as a reader?
As a reader, I read for language. I actually read a lot of poetry. I am not a poet. It's like not a moment of that. No. But I love, like one thing I love is when you read a novel by someone who is a poet and you can see it right away, right? Like Kaveh Akbar in Martyr. Yep. If anyone has not read it, you should read it. It's amazing. And it's just like a lusciousness to the language that's so wonderful and rich and great. So I read for language. I read for character. And I don't really read for stuff that happens necessarily. Right. Like I'm perfectly happy for stuff to happen, but I don't need anything to happen really.
Okay, so I know you stopped reading novels while you wrote, but now that you're done looking back, were any particular authors / books inspirations beyond the poets?
Yeah. So when I was doing, I stopped reading novels just during the first draft, except for what I had to read for work because I cover books, so I had to read the books for work. And because I was worried that I found that like some of my characters were getting muddy and were like other people's characters were sort of like making their way, and I was like, wait, that's not what they're like, and so I kind of stopped for a little bit. And I hope that's not always the case, and that I'll be able to, because I really miss novels when I'm not reading them. Like that's my favorite thing, and I become a cranky, not very nice person when I'm not reading novels. So apologies to my wife. Do you want some favorites? What do you want? Let's see.
I will take any recommendations, any favorites.
Okay.
Any fun stuff.
I mean, a book I read in the last couple of years that's like, I think had like a big influence was Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff, which is just so incredible for anyone who hasn't read it. It's like, with no spoilers, even though it's been out for a long time, you get to the back half of the book and it's just like mind blowing. I just like, that as a reader, I just got there and was like, how the hell did she do that? Like, oh my God, I want to do that. How do you do that? So that was a big one. And then, and then going in the total opposite direction. I mean, something I read for the first time last year was Middlemarch, because I'm a bad English major.
You made it through it before I did. I own 2 copies.
I recommend the audiobook and doing both. It helps.
Okay. All right.
But I read that and I was like so into it, and I kept wandering around to people being like, it's a great book. Middlemarch, like, did you know?
And if you haven't read How to Sleep at Night, there is a Middlemarch joke in there that is, the payoff is good.
Thank you very much.
I'm just saying that.
I appreciate that.
I suspected you had either just read it or
I had just read it.
Had still not read it, and I couldn't remember. I knew we talked about it at some point. I was like, I can't remember. Did she just read it, or is her copy? And I have one that has really nice French flaps and a great introduction by a writer I really like. It's still sitting there.
I bet it looks beautiful.
It's delightful.
That's
and
great.
It has a very nice spot on the bookcase.
Wonderful.
And it hasn't moved.
One day.
Someday. I've had so many people tell me it's fantastic. And I understand this. Not an English major. Okay, writing process. At the start of writing, did you know where your characters were going, or did they surprise you?
They surprised me. I figured out, I would say, so it was very much like I had these, 4 people, and they kind of arrived fairly fully formed, and then I just sort of wound them up and let them go. Yeah. And I would say I figured out, in terms of I knew where 2 of them would end up by the, and definitely by the end of the first draft, and that stayed. And then for the other 2, I went back and forth on it, and it changed in different drafts. And then we actually didn't kind of come to the ending until, I guess it was the last draft or something like that, maybe. I think it was. And we changed it, and then I think it works a lot better.
One of the things I've been thinking about a lot, partially because of the moment we're in the world, and partially because you have come up as a journalist, we still need fiction, though, right? Like, it's not, I love narrative nonfiction. Just tell me a story, right? And if it happens to be true, great. But what is it about fiction that holds us the way it does, right? Like, it's the great escape. It's the thing that you need. Sometimes it's deeply reassuring and reaffirming. And sometimes you get to make fun of other people. You know, it serves
You
a
would
million
never.
different purposes. No. Sorry. What? I try to keep my Boston in a box. No, but seriously, we keep coming back to it. Like, we're never going to stop. So what is it?
You know, I remember talking to a friend who is a novelist in 2020. I think when a lot of us were feeling like we needed to be doing something that, you know, felt kind of immediate, right? And I remember her being sort of, you know, and she's written wonderful books and just being like, oh, what am I doing? What am I doing with my life? And I was like, no, like people need this. They need it for a lot of reasons. They need it because like, what is life without the good stuff? Right? You know, like that's really important, right? Like, do you want to live in a world where it's like, you know, you're only taking your medicine all the time? Like, no. Right. And then also, you know, fiction allows you to do things that like, you know, you can, let's say you either, whether it's you want to entertain people or you want to think about some idea or you want to explore something, like you can do it with fiction in ways you can't with narrative nonfiction or journalism. You know, like it was one thing that was like such a gift for me was like, you know, there are these times when you're putting a story together and you're like, God, I wish I had this perfect quote. And when you're writing fiction, you can be like, they will say it. They will say this perfect thing and it will work better. And I can then, you know, then it will lead to this next thing and this next thing. And, you know, it allows for like discovery and like fun and joy and that kind of stuff.
It's like reading a transcript, right? Like there are times where you're reading a transcript for various reasons and it's really kind of awful stuff. And you're like, wait, did it really sound like that? Yeah, to be able to say, oh, I'm going to tweak this. I'm going to make it the thing that I need it to represent more than anything. To have that freedom where the idea is the thing that drives it. And if you get the language right, that's just a bonus.
Exactly, right? Like you get this like freedom to think about things in a way that like, as opposed to sort of the world presents you what has actually happened, which is important, you know, but and
I need both. Yeah, I mean, I need both, but I don't necessarily. And also there are things that need the immediacy of a daily report, or like a daily paper. And then there are other things where I'm like, no, I need time or I need time to pass so that we go back and we actually look at the documentation and write the thing that we have a little more context. And fiction, I just feel like you can play, even if you're writing a serious novel, you can play with words and ideas and character in a way that you just, everything becomes limitless. And I like to be surprised, right? And I don't know how many books I read a year. I don't know how many books I've read in my life. I have no idea. I do not keep a book list of the books I've read.
Is it a bajillion? Is that the answer?
I don't know if I can count that high. I'm only good with spreadsheets to a point. Fine. But I do know that I can still be surprised by prose. And I love the idea that even if I think, oh, yeah, this sounds like something I've read before, or it's a novel by a writer who has a body of work where you're just like, how have you written so many books? I don't understand. But to be surprised still is like the great joy for me of reading. Like, I actually finally read Frankenstein. Listen, I'm just filling in the gaps. It's really good, and I had no idea.
It's your Middlemarch. You're so excited. There you go.
It's not my Middlemarch because I someday I am going to read.
You're going to do it.
Absolutely,
your beautiful copy.
But all of these moments, right, where you're just like, oh, right, I haven't done this before, and it's so. Oh, love reading. What was the most challenging note you got from your editor, and did you take it?
I guess it was the end, like, because I think both of us were like, this is like it just didn't feel like it quite stuck the landing, and it felt like, you know, and then we went through some like different iterations of it, and then finally it's, you know, I think somebody told me that the end is like a mirror reflecting back on the rest of the book,
right?
And I found that really helpful. Just that sort of frame. And I think that just that thing kind of, it was like, oh, okay, let me try this. And then it worked.
There's also a line that I'm not going to share with the audience because it is a total spoiler, but one of the relationships is described in a way where it's like literally one line. And if you're reading really quickly, you might miss it. And it's really satisfying.
Well, thank you.
It's really, really satisfying. You've sort of answered this question, but I'm going to ask it. I'm going to ask it as it's written here, but we sort of covered this a little bit. What was the spark to make you want to write about love, marriage, and politics? Your own marriage, your parents, or your friends? And you can dance around this as much as you want.
No,
but knowing how many people in the audience know you already,
quite a few, yes.
Kind of tempted to.
No, it's fine because, I will say that there's like, there's this saying or thing or expectation that a lot of debut novels are basically like thinly veiled memoirs.
Right.
But this one really is not. Like there are like, Fang, the snake, is real. Fang existed and escaped. But you could, true story, in New Jersey.
And Fang is dead in the walls of that house.
Fang has been eaten by a turkey. I don't know. But he's no longer with us.
Okay.
I'm sorry, that was a spoiler. But the not in the book. Anyway, but I can count on one hand the number of things that are like kind of drawn from life that directly. So, I think it was, like wanting to write about like love and relationships. Like I think maybe that is an answer to a question you asked earlier. I read a lot for relationships. I just think that's, that's so fundamental to how we live. And I think that's so interesting. Yeah. And I totally have forgotten my train of thought.
Well, I mean, basically you're just you're not really pulling from, this is not thinly veiled anything.
Exactly.
This is just like, I made up a thing. I had a really good time. And
totally, that was it, right? As I was sort of like, I had these ideas, and then they just sort of went, and and I think that was part of the fun for me. Also, was that like I spend so much time writing nonfiction in my day job, right? I've written like 1,300 stories or something like that. Like it's been a lot, and so I wanted to do something that was like totally different. And I think writing about sort of like marriage and identity and ambition are these sorts of like universally interesting things.
And also sometimes stuff is just in the water.
Yeah.
Right? Like, or it's just in the air, and like suddenly you'll see 15 novels that are kind of sibling-ish. And it's 15 writers who don't hang out in the same coffee shop. And just like sometimes stuff is just in the air.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, I guess this is the moment. I mean, again, I got really invested in a bunch of suburbanites. All due respect. I mean, listen,
I'm very glad.
Sometimes you just find a pile of people where you're like, oh. I do have to ask, though.
Yeah.
There's a new book you're sort of working on. Obviously, we're not going to talk about details, but I'm just telling you, there's another book coming.
Oh, I'm definitely working on it. I'm actually on book leave right now.
Okay.
So I'm only working on that and not doing my day job, which is very nice for my wife so that she doesn't have to watch the children all of the time as she did last time. She's very nice. The new book is about a relationship between two women that lasts. We sort of follow them for almost 60 years. And through them, you can see how much being gay in America has changed in just one lifetime.
I love this idea.
Thank you.
And Fellowship Point, actually, listening to you say that, it makes me think of Alice Eliot Dark's last novel, Fellowship Point, which follows two women and their friendship over roughly the same time period.
Oh.
And it involves a lot of real estate.
I do love real estate.
It involves a lot of real estate.
Love real estate so much.
And maybe you'll get a chance to read it at some point.
I'll read it.
It is not small.
I'll read it.
It is not tiny. Now that you've finished the first novel, though, and now that you are on the receiving end of lots of questions and a little bit of, oh, hey, you. I mean, it is flipping the script a little bit.
It's so weird.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Like, how weird is it?
It is so weird, I mean, like, I got into journalism and, like, became a reporter because I like asking the questions. Right. And, like, it's just so deeply strange. I mean, I think it's weird because I'm very familiar with it, right? Like, 'cause I've conducted bajillion interviews, like you've read a bajillion books.
Right.
But, yeah, it's super different. But it's really fun. I mean, like, I think being interviewed about other things might be kind of scary, but it's about a book. And, I have to talk about books all day long. So that's fun. So.
Okay. And that's where I'm going to say thank you, because we have a book signing to set up. So if you can give us a couple of minutes to get the table set up and all of that good stuff, this is where I get to say, Elizabeth Harris, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. How to Sleep at Night is out now.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Yay.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.